Hello, I'm Dr. Daniel Griffin,
And I'm Dixon DePommier.
and today we're going to be discussing diabetes mellitus.
Wow.
You know, I have to say, Dixon, when I first started doing overseas medicine, I didn't think that diabetes mellitus was going to be critical in my toolbox, so to speak.
Sounds like you've changed your mind.
I really have, and what I've begun to realize that in a lot of areas of the world, diabetes is becoming a major health issue.
Goodness.
And there are several reasons why this is happening. Part of it is that people are not dying from other reasons.
Okay.
Part of it is that they may have, we'll say, changes in their diet. The introduction of different sources of nutrition, so to speak, or sources of calories that may be lacking someone in nutrition.
I see.
But when you're going to be looking at diabetes overseas, we're going to make a distinction between diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2.
Right.
So most healthcare providers are familiar with diabetes type 1 is an absence of insulin, and type 2 diabetes is initially going to start off with resistance to insulin. Type 1, you're probably not going to see as much in areas with limited resources because it's a resource-intensive challenge to manage someone who requires insulin on a regular basis.
So you mean those people die before they're old enough to get long-term care?
You know, unfortunately, in a lot of parts of the world, your type 1 diabetics will not survive without the resources required.
And this is a childhood infection or disease?
It's usually a malady of childhood or teenage onset.
Right.
And it can be pretty rapid onset.
Yeah.
And in a place with resources and an individual who's willing to adhere to therapy, they can do quite well. But in much of the world without those resources, these individuals do not make it to adulthood.
Is there any news as to the cause of the initial change from normal to type 1?
It tends to be an immune destruction of the insulin-producing or islet cells in the pancreas. We don't exactly know why.
Right. So one hypothesis says that the immune system killed off a virus that looked a little bit like the islets, and when the virus is gone, it's got another target. Look,
No.
There's another one. Where is it? I don't know how much proof there is for that hypothesis, but that's the one I've heard.
It's been amazing here. It's been, got my MD 20, 30 years ago,
Tell me about
and
it.
they're still working on that molecular mimicry hypothesis.
They are. Without too much progress.
Without too much progress.
Right. Frustrating. But you're more concerned about the other one because people are living longer in the tropics.
People are now living longer. People are now having diabetes type 2.
Type 2.
And it's a bit of a challenge because for a lot of communities that you might go and practice in, it's a paradigm shift. A lot of communities are used to clinicians coming in and treating acute illness. And so in some of our non-communicable diseases, we're going to be talking about the paradigm of a disease without a cure, a disease with management, and a management that goes on for years.
My goodness.
And that is a paradigm challenge. It's an educational challenge in a lot of communities. It also requires ongoing care and a longitudinal investment in the patients and the communities.
And you're looking at this as a lifestyle change disease, aren't you?
Part of it, we can talk about the lifestyle impact, but part of it also going to be medicine impact. But let's talk about the lifestyle.
Sure. I mean, you alluded to a diet change or the insinuation of certain, I don't want to call them fast foods because they take a long time to make, actually. Mm-hmm. They don't take so long to eat, but the world has become addicted to food on demand, food that's prepared in a way that allows it to remain preserved for quite a while so you can store it without too much refrigeration.
Mm-hmm.
And that appeals to a certain demand for salty, sweet, crunchy, spicy, all of those things wrapped up into the same bite. And, like a double meat burger, or I can go on. We've all gone down that road, unfortunately, and we haven't developed type 2 diabetes because maybe we saw the errors of our ways and changed our diets, but a lot of people become, you wouldn't call it addicted to it, but They're codependent. They go to these places and they say, I can get a complete meal for $10. Try to do that some other place.
Yep.
It's not such a complete meal, though, is
So
it?
this is good, and we're going to spend a lot of time on the impact of diet and exercise. But let's talk about what is diabetes. What is the disease? What is a disease?
Well, you just tried to define it before saying the lack of insulin. That's type 1, but type 2 is the making of insulin, but the inability of expressing insulin in response to the rise in glucose in your blood supply.
So we say insulin resistant. So you've now
Insulin
developed a resistance. The disease itself, if diagnosed early,
it's
is
horrible.
usually diagnosed asymptomatic. People are screened, you check a blood sugar. That's the ideal time to diagnose it, during the asymptomatic stage through screening.
Right.
In other settings, you may diagnose it once symptoms have started to occur.
Sure.
And this, the person might come in and say, I'm having problems with my vision, so visual disturbances. Polyuria, it might be peeing quite a bit.
Always thirsty.
Polydipsia, I'm drinking all the time. Usually that's because you're peeing all the time and now you're thirsty, you're replacing it. You may end up dehydrated because you can't keep up with the fluid losses.
Exactly right.
By the time you have polyuria and polydipsia, so frequent urination and frequent drinking, your blood sugars are over 300. You're usually spilling sugar into the urine. So you really want to make the diagnosis before that stage.
Of course.
But in a lot of settings, that's when you're going to make it.
Right.
If you're going to make the diagnosis based upon screening, there are certain criteria. And we put those in our book, where you can do a random blood sugar of greater than 200 milligrams per deciliter, or 11.1 millimolar per liter. The fasting blood sugar, so you have a person fast for more than 2 hours, greater than 126 milligrams per deciliter, or greater than 7.0 millimoles per liter. And in a lot of different national guidelines, there's going to be guidelines in different countries for what carries the diagnosis, what gives you access to resources.
Right.
It's going to be 3 measurements on 3 separate days. Some countries require 3 separate but consecutive days. So you're going to meet your criteria so that you have your diagnosis or not.
So you're the triage officer here, and you've got a line of people, and you've got thin people, slightly overweight people, more slightly overweight people, heavy, and obese. Which group do you think type 2 falls out into mostly?
You know,
Or groups?
I will say in the United States, as an example, 90% of your type 2 diabetics are going to be overweight. They're going to have weight challenges. They're going to be potentially obese, but more than ideal body weight. Only a minority, but you will see 10% of type 2 diabetics will be normal weight. Certain cultures, I shouldn't say cultures, I should say racial and genetic backgrounds, you're going to have very high incidences. Some of the native populations in the United States, in the Southwest, have maybe 50% or more of the adults over the age of 50 will end up with type 2 diabetes.
Wow.
And so there are certain genetic backgrounds that put you at risk for this. But as you're kind of alluding to, lifestyle, so
Sure.
weight gain. A lot of diabetes can be improved or controlled with getting yourself down to ideal body weight, reducing your calories.
Easier said than done.
Easier said than done. And we're going to talk about why that's true. Exercise, right? And that, again, I'm going to say easier said than done. You've got a population maybe that's working hard all day in the fields, and and they look at you and say, I'm supposed to exercise more. What are you talking about? I was at one place where I was doing an exercise class every evening for the patients with diabetes.
Oh, wow.
And, we had our music and we had a whole bunch of our whole routine. But that's an interesting issue. We talk about exercise. A lot of people exercise quite a bit.
Sure.
And what about the diet? And diet I want to spend quite a bit talking about.
Sure, please.
So you brought up, I think, the United States, a developed country paradigm where everyone's off to the fast food, ready-made.
They live busy lives. I don't have time to make a meal. I have to just go. So they go through the drive-in window at Wendy's. They get I didn't mean to mention a brand name. It's true for a lot of other places too. Mm-hmm. They grab something. It's wrapped up. They unwrap it. They eat it.
But many of these limited resource areas, well, let's go through the classic diet. We'll take diet in Central America, for instance.
Corn.
And then we're going to talk about a sub-Saharan African diet. So you might have corn. You might have rice. What type of rice?
Where?
In much of the world. Is it brown rice in most
No,
areas
it's
or
all
white?
It's all white.
And that's interesting because we think, oh, we'll encourage them to eat brown rice, but brown rice will become rancid. Brown rice will go bad.
This is all true.
So it seems so simple. Oh, we can just convince them to eat whole wheat bread and brown rice. That's not necessarily an option in a lot of places. I think that's important to think about, that naivete that people might bring initially. Another thing, a lot of parts of the world, very starch-rich diets, right? So plantains, maybe they're deep fried in lard.
Or bread, a lot of wheat.
A lot of bread. So you might have wheat and corn and grain-based high carbohydrate diets.
But they need that to go to work, to have the energy to make it through the day, don't they?
So a lot of this is not an easy fix.
Right.
We were in Malawi with the family, and they eat a white corn-based food as a main staple. And it was only occasionally that greens would be introduced into that. Greens were a bit of a luxury item.
That's right.
And so the idea of eating what people might perceive a balanced diet, a little fish, a little chicken, mostly vegetables, some whole grains, these are not necessarily options. It's not that people are making bad choices in many parts of the world. They're choosing among the limited amounts that they have.
All true.
And a lot of times now they have a little more, and so they might eat a little more. So now they're still eating high starch, high carbohydrate diets, but now they're a little heavier.
So my trip to Bhutan was punctuated by a visit to the National Health Service. And I actually talked to the Minister of Health in Bhutan. And he said, you know what our biggest problem is now? Urbanization and heart disease.
Oh my gosh.
You know, in a rural community that grows its own food and lives a very Spartan life, they're very happy people, but that's all changing too. So the more modernization you get, unless you offset that with behavioral changes that allows you to remain the same as you were before that happened, if you're not aware of it, you get trapped. And we're in a global epidemic of obesity.
We are, and it's it's easy to have a degree of arrogance and suggest that this is a lifestyle disease, but it's not necessarily a lifestyle disease.
It may be related to your microbiome.
It may very well, as we get rid of, as we've seen, as we do mass deworming campaigns, and individuals no longer are afflicted with all these ascaris and other infections, we see more diabetes.
We do.
We see more weight gain.
That's right.
But we also see less cognitive deficiencies. We see less deaths. So it's not easy.
Trade-offs.
There are trade-offs. So we talk about exercise. We talk about improving the diet. We have to be realistic. We're not accomplishing that here in the United States. So I'm not sure we're realistic if we think we'll accomplish that in other parts of the world. So we end up quite often using medications. And some of the medications, one of the first line agents that we like to use is something called metformin. And we'll often start with a 500 milligram tablet. We'll start with that once a day and maybe increase that up. Sometimes we'll add a second agent, a sulfonylurea class medication. But this complicates it because with metformin, you're getting sugar control, but without a risk of the sugars going too low. As soon as you add the sulfonylureas, you start being worried about pushing the sugars too low and the risks associated with that. Injectable insulin, as mentioned, is not always going to be something you have access to, but in some places, you might use a long-acting insulin to supplement your therapy. And in some areas where there are a little more resources, maybe where something like diabetes is becoming more of a national concern, you might have access to some of the other insulin.
So you look back over time at the life tables of humans when they began to keep track of how old people are before they die. And the average age of death has been rising steadily in many places. I'd say even in places that you would least expect it, like Cuba, for instance, which has a limited set of resources for medicine. And they eat a very bland diet of fish, poultry, but they raise their food on the rooftops. They have green gardens almost on every roof. of every building. So they don't waste any space in terms of that. But the average lifespan of a woman living in Cuba is something like 86 years old. That's one of the oldest average ages for that age group.
Yeah.
For that,
for that whole part of the world, I would
for
say.
that,
Yeah.
for the entire Earth. And
Yeah.
it's the diet. I mean, if you had that diet, you might not last that long.
Yeah.
Neither would I. But it's hard to generalize about human population since we live everywhere, we eat everything, and we drink everything.
Mm-hmm.
So then sort all of that out and tell me what's going on, and it's very difficult. It's
Yeah.
very difficult. So I don't blame people for angsting over this, and for one report comes out of Harvard that says coffee is good for you, and the next year the other professor gets tenure because he says, no, it's not good for you. Look at this, and you've got these conflicting dietary restrictions. It's a mess. It's a mess. There's no underlying simplicity to any of this, which makes it difficult to give recommendations.
No, there's no easy answers. So hopefully we've given people some answers.
No, we want to confuse you more than actually direct you to the right answer, because there isn't any right answer here. I'm sorry, I'm on the other side of that fence.
So, all right. So thank you for joining us today. I think just a couple of pearls we want to get in there is that we may think when we go to a lot of these limited resource areas that it's all going to be about infectious diseases, communicable diseases, but all of the chronic diseases, diabetes, hypertension, heart failure, cardiovascular disease, those are all going to be important maladies that the patients you're serving will present with, and it's going to be important that you have the skill set to address those.
No question.
All right. Thank you for joining us.